Good afternoon to everybody. As Karen said, I'm the campaign officer with the Irish Wildlife Trust. We're one of the IEN members. And so we're holding this webinar series about in the run-up to the Citizens' Assembly on biodiversity loss. And there's going to be a meeting of the Citizens' Assembly this weekend. And that's going to be running through to the end of the year. And one of the things that we'll be asking people to do is to make a submission to that assembly, which is open at the moment. So this was really just to try and generate interest in the Citizens' Assembly, but also to try and increase the level of knowledge and awareness among people so that they could make an informed submission. I would direct you maybe to the Irish Wildlife Trust website. We've already made our submission, and we have a special page on our website to show people how to make a submission, but also to you could have a look at our submission that we made and maybe take some of our ideas if you want to. So I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully I'll go to full screen there. Okay, is everyone seeing that? Karen, you're seeing that and hearing me?
Yes, thank you. All clear.
Great, okay. So I'm going to talk to you today. You're going to hear, if you follow this webinar series, you're going to hear from some great activists and experts in different fields of biodiversity or different areas of it, particularly, you know, forests and the marine and freshwater and so on. But I'm going to talk to you today about biodiversity in general. So it's kind of an overview of what biodiversity is, why it's important, why we have a biodiversity crisis. But also I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the context that we're in, because unfortunately, we don't just have a biodiversity crisis. We also have a climate crisis that you're probably aware of. And there's a lot of overlap between climate issues and biodiversity issues that are important to integrate if our response is going to be an appropriate one. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But the first thing that I'd like to introduce you to are the planetary boundaries. And so this concept has been around for over a decade now, and I find it very useful because it helps to overcome the way we tend to think about things in compartments. So we tend to look at, you know, the climate crisis is over here. We also have a water pollution crisis that's, you know, somewhere else, and maybe these require different solutions, or we'll prioritize one over the other, which we see quite a lot. You know, climate is too important, we'll worry about biodiversity some other time. We'll worry about our water, or also maybe that we'll come up with a solution to you know, that may work from a climate perspective in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but may result in knock-on undesirable impacts on, say, biodiversity. So the idea of the planetary boundaries was trying to look at this in a more holistic way. And specifically what the scientists at the Stockholm Resilience Centre were trying to do was to try and put a data around what are the physical characteristics of the Earth that make it habitable for humans, and where are those boundaries, and have we exceeded those boundaries? And you can see from the graph that the answer is yes, we have exceeded them. But they came up with these series of planetary boundaries that I think is a useful way of seeing where we're at. And you can see some of them would be familiar to you, and maybe others less so. Climate change is probably the most high profile of these. And if we move in an anti-clockwise way, you'll see the next one there is biosphere integrity. So the biosphere basically describes the living world, and we all live in the biosphere. And basically, this is biodiversity. And you know, the atmosphere and the state of the waters, whether that's in the ocean or in the rivers, that is that is controlled or regulated by biodiversity. If there was no biodiversity, the atmosphere would be very different. You see, then we move into land system change, and this is principally around converting natural ecosystems into highly modified human landscapes, so particularly deforestation, for instance, where we're chopping down forests to create more space for agricultural pastures, particularly beef, which is a particularly acute issue in the Amazon. We then move down, we see freshwater use, and freshwater, of course, is critical to all life on land, particularly, or well, certainly humans are no exception. And the amount of fresh water that's available for human use, or even for terrestrial life, is very, very small compared to the amount of water that's in total that's available, mostly in the oceans, of course, also frozen in ice caps and so on. But we see freshwater use as being an acute problem now. We didn't have to look very far over the summer to see droughts. But it's not only the fresh water; it is also the quality of the water, how that water is delivered, whether it's nice and even throughout the year, or whether it's coming in devastating floods followed by devastating droughts. The one at the bottom, you see their biogeochemical flows. Is a big word, but really what it means is the P there stands for phosphorus and the N stands for nitrogen. And really what we're talking about here is the chemistry of certain systems. Now, particularly, it's to do with waters. So the amount of nutrients that particularly comes from agriculture, whether that's through animal dung or artificial fertilizer, but also human waste escaping into the air and onto the soil, but particularly into waterways, has literally changed the chemistry of those waterways, and that has had significant impacts. Ocean acidification there describes how the process of burning fossil fuels, which has changed the atmosphere, put more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. A lot of that carbon dioxide has been absorbed by the ocean. Now, carbon dioxide is very soluble in liquid. It gets washed out of the atmosphere by rain, and it makes a very weak acid called carbonic acid. And also the ocean absorbs it as well. So this is leading to the acidification of the ocean, and that obviously has enormous consequences for animal life, in particular in the ocean, and in particular animals that make shells out of calcium carbonate. So everything from crabs and snails to certain types of plankton will use calcium carbonate. And then you see on the right-hand side, you see atmospheric aerosols. So this was to do with aerosols were associated with the depletion of the ozone, and you see the ozone layer there as well is included. And novel entities. Novel entities is a word that, or a term that describes the volume of synthetic chemicals that have entered our atmosphere and our water and our soil and our bodies even, particularly since the start of the industrial era, but particularly in the post-war period, the amount of novel entities has ballooned. Now, one of the things you might have noticed as we went around that circle is that there's a great deal of interconnection between the different issues. Ocean acidification is driven by climate change. Land system change is resulting in biodiversity loss and changes to freshwater use. Our agricultural systems are driving changes to biogeochemical flows, and so on and so on. So it's very important to look at these as an interconnected whole rather than just a series of discrete issues. Now, this graph is actually a bit out of date. I should have got a more up-to-date one, because at the time this graph was drawn, the writers were trying to determine which of the planetary boundaries have we already exceeded. And they determined that we've already gone beyond the limits of biodiversity destruction. We've already gone beyond the limits of land system change, and we've gone beyond the limits of the biogeochemical flows in terms of the nutrients that have gone into waterways. We're in the danger zone for climate change, and since this was drawn, we have also gone beyond the boundaries for novel entities, and I think it's ocean acidification is another one that has deteriorated since this graph was first drawn, and this is like only in the last decade or so. So really what you see there, the green and the red and the orange, the green is where the safe living space is for human beings, and as you can see, we have left that space in too many instances. So our goal is not necessarily just to address climate change or reverse biodiversity loss. It's to get us into that green space in the middle. Now, of course, the other thing that is very important is that over 7 billion humans live on this planet, and our lives contribute to environmental issues in very different ways. And so this idea of there being social thresholds as well as the planetary boundaries was developed particularly in Kate Raworth's book called Donut Economics. And her idea was how are we going to get inside this donut where we are within the safe biophysical space, while also providing basic social needs for people around the world. And you can see the graph on the left there is showing you the range of countries. At the bottom, it's the biophysical boundaries, and on the left, it's the social threshold. So you can see there's a vast difference between countries that haven't exceeded biophysical boundaries, but are not providing good lives for their citizens. And then at the other end, you'll see at the top right-hand corner, you'll see that, you know, basically the rich countries of the world that more or less do provide for their citizens, but that is coming at a great expense to the biosphere. The donut example on the right is for Ireland. Basically, how is Ireland doing? And you can see from that we are doing well in terms of meeting social targets, but we're not doing well when it comes to the biophysical. We're basically exceeded all of the biophysical targets, and I'll kind of allude to that later on as to why it is that Ireland can have provide such, you know, basically materially good lives to most of our citizens, while basically exporting the environmental impacts to other countries. And there's Ireland up there, so it's where you'd expect it to be among the rich countries of the world. So this kind of brings us to the idea of climate justice, and climate justice is about recognizing that not all countries are contributing to this crisis equally. Now, this one is just about CO2 emissions, and you can see that there is great disparities between different countries. Now, this is from 2020, which is, you know, possibly not an average year in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, but you'll see, for instance, the average emissions from a regular Ethiopian was 0.13 tons of CO2 per year per person. Whereas in India, it was more than 10 times that. It was 1.17 tons. And in Sweden, when you move up into the richer countries, Sweden emitted nearly 4 tons, so 3.83 tons of CO2 per person in 2020. But Ireland is twice that again. Ireland's figure for 2020 was 6.75 tons of CO2 per person. So it really shows that in Ireland, we are contributing to the climate crisis way out of proportion to even the European average, and an absolutely mind-boggling level of emissions compared to your average person in sub-Saharan Africa. And this is really important when you hear people talking about the impact of China, or, you know, what does it matter what we do when Brazil is doing this, that, and the other. We have eaten up already an awful lot of the safe living space, and we have a moral duty to make sure that we address our environmental footprint on a per person basis. Now, this graph, this diagram comes from a biannual report that comes from the Zoological Society of London and the World Wildlife Fund. And it's basically, you see the title of it is The Great Acceleration. Now, never mind really what the types of data are on the graphs. You'll see they all have more or less the same shape. It's kind of a ski jump kind of a shape. And this acceleration is referred to as the general increase in nearly everything. So whether you're looking at the world population, the GDP, the amount of fertilizer used, the amount of water used, the number of large dams, the level of international tourism, it's all gone off the scale. It has all increased exponentially since the middle of the last century. And, you know, kind of the mirror image of that then is the exponential destruction of natural systems and the release of pollution, whether that's greenhouse gases, whether it's the level of ocean acidification there, deforestation, and so on. Marine fish capture, you'll see, has already passed, so that's on the way down again because of the level of overexploitation. So you'll see this kind of exponential growth, and it's 50 years this year since the Club of Rome, which are a group of academics, modeled our rate of consumption and concluded, you know, surprise, surprise, that you can't have exponential growth of anything within a finite system. So the Earth is our finite system, and you simply can't have continuous growth like this in anything. Whether that's the economy or a level of extraction or a level of consumption when you have a fixed system. And that's a really important thing to remember as we exceed the planetary boundaries. And again, this is related to our level of consumption. And this is also a graph from the same report that I referred to, and it shows how consumption patterns vary across the world. So it's a very similar graph to the one I showed you about greenhouse gas emissions. And basically in Ireland, like in many Western countries, we're simply consuming too many resources to sustain a healthy life on Earth. And then you see there are countries there that maybe are not consuming enough resources to provide decent lives for their people. So again, we're back to this idea of climate justice or global justice. Now, this talk is about biodiversity, so I really wanted to move on and talk about biodiversity, but that really puts it into the context that biodiversity loss is not isolated and it's not separated from our consumption or from our greenhouse gas emissions or the other environmental problems we face. Now, with biodiversity, while it has much in common, there are also some very important differences in terms of how we look at biodiversity loss versus, let's say, climate change. And one of the most significant ones, in my view, is that climate is basically the physical stroke chemical composition of the atmosphere. It's what's driving climate change. And that's very easy to measure. In fact, there are monitoring stations. You can go on, you can watch day to day the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere in any given place or at any of these monitoring stations. And you can see how that changes from day to day and from week to week and month to month. And countries can measure their greenhouse gas emissions. We get inventories from the Environmental Protection Agency here in Ireland that measures our greenhouse gases. That means it's easy to set targets, not so easy to meet them, but easy to set targets, easy to see how we're doing against those targets, and easy to see what effect those are having on the atmosphere. Biodiversity doesn't fall into any of those categories at all. In fact, biodiversity is extremely difficult to measure. For instance, we know that there have been nearly 2 million species identified and described by science so far, 2 million. But we know also that this is a fraction of the level of biodiversity that actually exists. One estimate, or at least the range of estimates that are mostly accepted by scientists, is that the true number of species is somewhere between 5 and 11 million. And these tend to be what are called eukaryotic species. So these are kind of the more familiar critters and plants and stuff that we're used to. When you look at microbes, the new technologies around DNA sequencing are revealing absolutely mind-blowing levels of biodiversity in microbes. And one figure I found recently was that it's possible that there are 1 trillion different species of microbes on the earth. So this is absolutely mind-boggling. So it's not only that we don't even know, the number of species that we have on Earth. We know also that all of those species are interacting with each other, and they're interacting with each other in extremely complicated ways. Every species has an impact on the species around it. There are feedback loops. There's interactions with the non-living world. You see in that diagram, the energy from the sun, the water, and it's very, very dynamic. It is changing continuously. So it is quite possible, and this is getting into maybe a philosophical note, it's quite possible that biodiversity is not understandable, as in it's just going to be beyond human abilities to understand biodiversity. So for instance, when it comes to our approach to the climate crisis, much of it has been directed by modelers who have been able to model the Earth's climate system, which is complicated, but we can put figures on it and we can use those models, and those models have proved to be very useful. There's very little modeling of biodiversity systems that has been done, and that's partly because they are so incredibly complex, not just complicated, complex, so many feedback loops and so much that we don't understand. And of course, this makes it very difficult from a policy point of view, but it also makes it very scary from our own point of view, because we have removed so many of the species from the natural systems that they have worked in for so long that really we don't know what kind of effects are coming down the line. Now, when species interact like this, we call that an ecosystem. And an ecosystem basically is anything you can draw a line out of, a line around. There's an ecosystem in your gut, there's an ecosystem in your garden, there's an ecosystem, let's say your local forest is an ecosystem. And also you could say that the entire Earth is one ecosystem. So, but these ecosystems do work in certain ways. And we know that for many millions of years, they have more or less been very, very stable. Healthy, naturally functioning ecosystems are more or less very stable. Yes, there have been ice ages and so on. But for instance, the tropical forests in, let's say, Southeast Asia the Amazon, have been more or less undisturbed for millions of years. And that has obviously allowed for a stable climate, stable hydrology, stable supplies of food and materials for the humans that have lived in these places also. And so as we sweep these systems away, we are exposing ourselves in a way that has it's certainly never happened before in human history. Although you will probably be familiar with individual cases where ecosystems have collapsed and have resulted in also at least contributed significantly to the collapse of human civilizations, such as Easter Island, such as the Maya in Central America, and there are other examples. There's even an example from Ireland, for instance, the farming civilization that lived on the north coast of Mayo 5,000 years ago were dairy farmers, but it is believed that that system collapsed because of deforestation and changes to their environment. So this is happening now on a planetary scale. And of course, we don't have anywhere to move to as these systems collapse. And this is just one graph. This comes from the World Wildlife Fund report that I referred to earlier. And they've been measuring the populations of animals with a backbone. That's a vertebrate. So they've developed this living planet index, although it is sometimes referred to as the dying planet index, because it is showing that the populations of these large animals is falling off a cliff. It has fallen by that figure is actually out of date. It's over 70% now since 1970. And 1970 was not a baseline for healthy global ecosystems. 1970 was well into the industrial age. But you can see even within my lifetime, I was born in 1973, that over 3/4 of the populations of the numbers of large animals has just been exterminated. We like to say it has declined, or it has, vanished, faded away into nothing. But actually, they have been exterminated by our human societies and our voracious appetite for consumption. And of course, you can't take animals out of a system and hope at this kind of scale and hope that that system is going to remain stable. It's just not going to happen. So really what I've spoken to you about so far is biodiversity at a global level, and we know that those global ecosystems now at risk are at risk of collapse. But also we must recognize that in Ireland, we don't have natural ecosystems in Ireland anymore because we have destroyed them all. And this comes to one of the central paradoxes that I've been trying to deal with, is that how can you explain to people, A, that biodiversity is essential for life, secondly, that we have destroyed all of our biodiversity. And then lastly, by the way, you go to the supermarket and you've got this enormous abundance and choice available to you. And you can go out and you can buy an SUV and you can go on holidays and you can do whatever you want. And yet we live in a completely collapsed ecosystem here at home. And the answer to that question really comes from some of the maps that I showed you earlier about our consumption, because we in Ireland, we could no longer sustain the standard of living that we do, or the level of consumption that we do, just through resources from our island. So we import an awful lot of goods to feed our appetite for consumption. And of course, those goods come from somewhere. They come from mines. They come from fish populations, they come from forests or wetlands around the world, and frequently we have no idea where they're coming from. But what we do know is that that level of consumption...
Yeah, I have them looking at a biodiversity thing here, and Laura's...
Maybe we could mute people if that's okay. But what we do know is that level of consumption is driving the collapse of ecosystems at a global level. And that is going to have enormous ramifications for humanity. And some standout examples that you're probably familiar with is what looks like going to be the imminent collapse of the Amazon rainforest, the imminent collapse of the polar ice caps, and the loss of coral reef ecosystems by the middle of this century. And that's going to be catastrophic for biodiversity, but also on the people that live there, the people that depend on it, but also globally, it will feed into the other crises that we face. So let's spend a few minutes looking at Ireland. And what I'm showing you here is a field that we're all familiar with, and a lot of us drive past fields like this every day, and we don't think there's anything unusual about it. In fact, we kind of look at it and go, well, that's great. That's, the farmers are putting the land to good use. And Ireland is 40 shades of green, and our landscape is beautiful. But actually what you're looking at is a collapsed ecosystem. So the question I'm asking here is, where has nature gone? And certainly this field, wherever it is, would once have been forest. It would have been dense, lush, native forest, maybe dominated by oak, maybe dominated by willow, who knows. Certainly our forest ecosystem was quite diverse. But we know that 80% of Ireland was covered in forest, and that figure is now probably around 1%. I say probably because we don't even have an accurate figure for the extent of native forest that we have in Ireland. But we know it's, whatever the figure is, it's not big, and the most commonly used figures are 1%. So that means that Ireland is one of the most deforested countries in the world. And this is also important when we look at the horrors of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil and the destruction of the Amazon, and how can they do this? Brazilians will look at Ireland and go, well, look, you can't talk to us about protecting your forest. How have you protected your forest? Well, basically our forest is gone. We've more or less destroyed it. And even in the tiny pockets of forest that do remain, those are also being destroyed through invasive species or overgrazing by farm animals or deer or whatever it happens to be. We've never made any efforts really to protect even the remnants of native forests that we have. But when the forest was gone, and I should add, you know, the forests are gone quite a long time in Ireland, even by the time of British colonization. It's believed, you know, the best estimate we have among people who have studied it is that Ireland was no more than 10% native forest at that time. So most of the deforestation occurred before large-scale British settlement happened in Ireland, although certainly the British did destroy whatever was left of our forests at that stage. But the farmland that took over was a relatively biodiverse place. The soil would have been very biodiverse. Fields like this would have had nesting curlews, maybe nesting skylarks, quail, corncrakes, and so on. The crop in the field, whatever that might have been, would have been full of insect life. And that's all gone now as well. A field like this today is a pretty quiet and still place. But note, it's not dead. There are things growing in it, but it is a tiny shadow of what it used to be. And certainly that is partly because of the application of monoculture cultivation. So particularly in grazing systems, farmers have been encouraged to just plant one type of grass. And also the application of chemical nitrogen has severely disrupted soil biodiversity and as well as gone on into our rivers. So our farmland these days, not only is it a collapsed ecosystem, but it's nearly dead compared to what it once was. And then, of course, we go up into our mountains and we think, okay, well, maybe, you know, these brown parts of our country are where biodiversity is. And this is a photograph from Wicklow, and it's showing you a Wicklow Mountains National Park. And unfortunately, this landscape is nearly as dead as the grassland that I showed you before. And that's maybe for very different reasons. Partly it's because the peatlands up here have been cut away. Partly it's because of the extent of fires that have occurred. Partly it's because of the number of free-ranging farm animals we have in these places that suppress any regeneration of trees in particular. And also you'll see at the back of this photograph, a significant threat in Ireland is the 10% of our land that has been covered in non-native conifer plantations. And traditionally, it is places like this that have been targeted for these monoculture plantations because basically landscapes like this were seen as useless and unproductive. So today, even though this is a national park, it's pretty, it's not exciting from a biodiversity point of view. And much of the bird life that remains in these places, paradoxically, is sustained because of the number of dead sheep that are lying around. And then when we go into our lowlands, we find that our rivers, and Ireland is a wet country, that our river systems, which provide us in theory with water, with clean water, protect us, our towns from flooding, and provide, you know, enormous amenity value. A lot of these systems have also collapsed because they have been not only polluted by human and animal waste, but also have been physically modified. And this is an example of the River Boyne in County Meath, which is a special area of conservation. So on paper, this is one of our most important biodiversity sites, but you'll see that it has been artificially straightened. You'll see the mounds on either side that have been dug up with the spoil from the bottom of the river. And this has been done under the Arterial Drainage Act in order to create more farmland, which obviously you can see it has succeeded in doing. But this has led to the collapse of the river system. It has left us vulnerable to flooding. Downstream of this, the water will move faster and is a threat to people. And it also provides very little for biodiversity. Yes, again, you'll note it's not dead. It takes an awful lot to kill all life in any given area, but this is again a shadow of what it was. The salmon population in the Boyne has collapsed. Just the diversity of plant life and animal life in here just isn't there anymore. You'll notice also the riparian vegetation, so that's the vegetation on either side of the river, has been completely stripped away. And that's very important as well in terms of providing nutrients for the river and the animal life in the river, but also slowing the flow of the water, which now doesn't happen anymore. Now, one of our most important soil types and our most important habitat types in Ireland is peatland. And about possibly between 15 and 20% of Ireland is covered in peatland. But again, these have been traditionally seen as useless areas. And yes, we've been cutting turf for a very long time, but certainly since the 1950s, the technological solutions have become available in order to basically turn our peatlands into open pit mines, which is what has happened throughout the Midland counties. This will be a familiar sight, certainly until recently, for anybody living in Midland counties. And this used to be a raised bog. This used to be one of the most important habitats in Western Europe, a unique place for plants and animals. And you'll see here exactly kind of what I was trying to refer to before with our planetary boundaries. Not only is this mined out landscape devoid of biodiversity, it's also releasing vast amounts of carbon into the atmosphere, and it's also polluting the waterways. You'll see the drains that have been dug through it to try and get the water off the land. They are bringing silt into the local river systems that are contributing then to the collapse of river ecosystems. So again, we're seeing how a lot of these issues are intimately interconnected. And then, of course, we look out at sea. Ireland is an island. 90% of our territorial space is marine, it's ocean. And it's very easy to look out on the sea and imagine that this is a wilderness. At least, you know, surely there's plenty of space here for nature. But unfortunately, the seas around Ireland have been fished at an industrial scale for centuries, actually. But certainly in the second half of the 20th century, the expansion of bottom trawling has basically saved most of the life out of the sea with absolutely devastating consequences. This is the contents of a bottom trawl from the Irish Sea. And the fisherman in this instance was trying to catch prawns, and you'll see there are prawns in there, but you can see also that it's mostly not prawns. It's mostly young fish. It's basically the contents of the ocean. And one of the big problems with bottom trawling is that most of that unwanted catch then is also just dumped back into the sea. So it's actually gargantuan waste of life, as well as destruction of marine habitats. And also we've learned in recent years that bottom trawling, because it agitates sediments on the bottom of the sea, it releases a similar amount of greenhouse gases as the aviation industry. So a very carbon intensive, destructive form of fishing that has affected pretty much everywhere, and not just in Ireland. I mean, around the coast of Europe and pretty much everywhere, except for maybe under the ice shelves of Antarctica, has been bottom trawled at least once. But some countries such as Indonesia and Thailand have banned bottom trawling or severely restricted it, and that's something that we haven't done in Ireland or even in Europe, which is absolutely insane in my point of view. So basically, what impact has that collapse in ecosystems had on our wildlife? And some of these species that I'm showing you here, you might be familiar with, some of them maybe not. The crane disappeared sometime in the 1700s and returned to a bog in County Offaly 2 years ago, and that's very welcome. I believe they nested again this year. I haven't heard whether the chicks were successful or not, but let's hope so. The North Atlantic right whale is a very large type of whale that used to come into our bays on the west coast, but was hunted. Imagine Ireland had a whaling industry, not that it was particularly big, but these whales were hunted to extinction on this side of the Atlantic. And you see there are a number of birds. The capercaillie used to be a bird in our forests. The bittern would have been found in our wetlands. The goshawk. There's rumours that goshawk is coming back to Ireland, and the golden eagle, of course, has been reintroduced. And we're seeing a lot of osprey. And these kind of things show you that nature actually can recover when it is given a bit of time and space. But also, though we have driven about 120 species to extinction in Ireland, from wolves and bears to different types of mosses and plants that very few people would be familiar with, Also, the abundance and general diversity of life in Ireland has declined dramatically in the last decades. And all of these species you see in front of you here are species that were common and widespread when I was a child growing up in the 1980s. And all of those species are now threatened with extinction. The corn bunting actually went extinct in the 1990s, is the last officially documented extinction to have happened in Ireland. The nightjar is a type of bird that hasn't been recorded nesting in Ireland in a long time. I can't put a figure on it, but it's certainly more than a decade. And we've heard virtually nothing about it. There's been no schemes for farmers or anything like that to protect the nightjar. And this is normally how extinction happens. It doesn't go with a bang, it goes with a whisper, and nobody really notices that these things are gone. But I want to leave you on a positive note. As I usually say on this part of my talks, if I haven't shocked or upset you at some point, well, then I haven't done my job very well. Because really we should be shocked and upset as to what has happened in our country. But I also don't want you leaving this talk with a sense of fatalism in terms that nothing can be done, because an awful lot can be done. And we know, as I showed you there about the return of certain species, we know that we basically know what we need to do if we want wildlife to come back. We know that rewilding works. We know that we can restore forests through rewilding. We know that we can reintroduce species. We can try to knit together the ecosystems once again. We can produce food. Lots of areas of Ireland are very favorable for producing a vast range of different types of food. And we know that we can do that in a low carbon and nature friendly way. What I'm showing you in this drawing is a concept of, somewhere in Ireland that has salmon in the rivers and forests in the mountains and, different types of food production. But we haven't really had the ethical debate in Ireland as to our responsibility to the different species that live in Ireland, basically the other citizens of our country. Is it ethically acceptable for us to drive them to extinction in order to, for instance, promote dairy exports? I've never heard a debate around that, but certainly tacitly we have done that. We have decided that freshwater pearl mussel, for instance, can go extinct in many of our rivers in order to perpetuate dairy expansion in those places. So that's basically a very clear economic choice that we've made over the natural world. And that's really where I think we need to be going in terms of addressing it. But I want to assure people that the solutions are there if we were to get on and implement those solutions at scale. I think we could have a wonderful country that provides, fantastic jobs in rural Ireland, produces food, and allows us to have contact with nature every day of the week, no matter where you live. So hopefully you believe me when I say that. But I'll hand back now to Karen, and hopefully we have time for any questions you might have.
Thanks, Pádraic. I know it's really challenging to fit so much in a limited amount of time. And thanks so much for your talk this afternoon. So we're going to hand it over to participants. Yeah, if you could use the hand raise function. I'll also watch the chat. I also see, I think that's Pádraic's tagline: depressing and enlightening. Thanks, Damien, for that feedback. Okay, over to Natasha.
Hi, Pádraic. How are you?
Hi, Natasha.
So a lot of the stuff that you talked about is driven by policy, government policy. And I suppose one of the things that we come across is this kind of Venn diagram where we see economic, social, and environment in these three circles. And like the challenge there, I think, is to have the environment or biodiversity underpinning like the most basic fundamental aspect of it rather than as part of this thing. And I wonder how you see we go about trying to change the mindset that people realize that if we don't have a living biosphere, we have nothing. We have no economics, no social, nothing. So in the Citizens Assembly, I mean, I think you talked about having something like the rights of nature in the Constitution or something like that. Maybe you can expand a bit. Thank you.
Yes, so we boiled it down in our submission to the Citizens Assembly. We boiled it down to two main issues that need to be addressed. One is the policy issue, as you pointed out, and how can we hold the state to account for the promises it makes on our behalf. So for instance, we were making the point that if we've already committed to ending overfishing, we've already committed to creating marine protected areas, we've already signed up to all kinds of laws about water quality and species protection, but we don't implement any of it. So how is it that the government feel that this is an option for them? Why do they feel that this is a pain-free option for them to basically ignore legislation and initiatives in this regard? And we have to change that. So one of, it's not an easy thing to do, but I mean, what we were suggesting was that we need to have a biodiversity act that basically puts our biodiversity action plan on a legal footing, so that it's kind of like the Climate Act, and that includes the mechanisms to hold governments to account and to hold ministers and individual state agencies like Coillte and the OPW to account in a meaningful way, because that's just simply not happening at the moment. The other thing you talked about there is, how do we get people to understand that biodiversity is the foundation upon which we all stand? And there's no shortcut to that, in my view. It just comes down to education. We have to like, I know from talking to people who are not in, let's say, our circle, and maybe we all have this experience when we go to the pub with our mates and we start talking about these things, and the completely blank expressions that are coming back at us. When we talk about something going extinct that nobody has ever heard of before, that people don't understand what a native forest looks like. The only way I think we're going to overcome that is by education, showing people what these places look like, showing what we have lost, showing what we can do. And I think if you had those things in combination, the policy, accountability, and the massive education program that I think we need, then we might start seeing some progress.
Thanks, Pádraic. There's a question here from Mary Sinnott. Question for Pádraic: what 2 or 3 things would you ask us to do to influence this?
Yeah, thanks, Mary. I mean, I would say that making a submission to the Citizens Assembly is very important. We hope that the Citizens Assembly will come up with some really strong recommendations. Of course, we've no guarantee that the government will pay any heed to them, but ultimately, we all have a role to play in holding our politicians to account and letting them know that this is something that's important to them. So, for instance, if I'm talking to politicians, a lot of them will say, well, like, very few people are saying to me that they think biodiversity is important. So let's say for turf cutting, if you're a rural politician and you say, no, we're never going to stop turf cutting, people will cheer. If you say, no, we have to stop turf cutting so that we can protect biodiversity and climate, they don't get the same cheers that the others will do. So we have to change that. We have to cheer on the politicians and reward them for doing the right thing, and when they do take risks, that's very important. So 2 things then, maybe, Mary. I would hope that as many people as possible will make a submission to the Citizens Assembly, but also to, when the opportunity arises, or maybe even when it doesn't arise, you can contact your local politicians and say to them that this is important, and say you're worried about it, and that if they're looking for your vote the next time an election comes around, this is the thing that you'll be making your decision on.
Thanks, Pádraic. I just wanted to have a follow-up question there from Helen Shaw. So she asked how much of this is flowing into the Citizens Assembly. And I think, as you explained there, we just don't really know in terms of what lands with them. We know that we should be making submissions and, you know, telling them what we think. But another part of the question is to echo what Mary had said. How do we make this conversation become mainstreamed, given the power of the beef and dairy industry in particular?
Yes, I mean, many of our problems, and I say our as in, you know, NGOs, many of our problems comes from the power of influential lobby groups that governments listen to in a way that, you know, they don't listen to necessarily NGOs. And maybe, you know, that is me. I have a feeling. I mean, that is really a product of our democracy. Our democracy is open to lobbyists in that way. So that politicians don't always act in the wider public good. And we see that all the time. We're seeing it today, for instance. We see lobby groups in Ireland and in Europe trying to undermine European Union efforts to introduce a nature restoration law. So this is absolute constant background wallpaper to our lives. Now, we have seen that change, though. I mean, I don't think the beef and dairy group are as powerful as they were. That's bad news for farmers. Farmers need to be represented, but they haven't been represented by people who are eager to address the climate and biodiversity emergency. So that is definitely a big problem. How do we change that conversation? I think the more conversations we have about it, the more changes that will arise. So what I mean by that is, Ireland is blessed with amazing community groups, so chances are these conversations are being had at your community level, and they will be open to you to get involved in that. You don't have to have all the answers. I think it can be daunting for community groups in particular when they're looking at, let's say, farmers spreading slurry. A community group can't change government policy, and the reasons why the farmer is spreading the slurry or something like that. But if enough community groups start talking about these things and start saying, look, we want a future for our farmers, but we don't want a future where our rivers are just rank and that there's no nature in our countryside, then these are the conversations that must be had with local politicians. And I think local community groups have a unique position to play in having those conversations with local politicians in a way that, let's say, national NGOs can't.
Thanks, Pádraic. Mary, I see your hand raised, but I'm just going to go through the chat, if that's okay, because some of those came in before. So I think Grania Tynan's question was kind of covered there, Pádraic. What are some actions we can take as individuals? So we've talked about a couple of things that people can do through their local groups, through making a submission to the Citizens' Assemblies, to talking through their TDs, especially at election time. I think it's really effective, but all the time. One more kind of specific note is, are there any low-hanging fruit?
Yes, there are low-hanging fruit. My number one low-hanging fruit is the ocean, because the ocean is so big, and really there are a very small number of people actually making a good living out of the ocean. And I'm thinking about the very large industrial fishing boats. I think ending industrial fishing, creating large marine protected areas, could be the quickest, most effective thing we could do for climate and biodiversity. On land, there are also quick wins, and I'm thinking in particular the protection of our peatlands. So we know, for instance, that an awful lot of our peatlands are negatively impacted by basically hundreds of thousands of free roaming sheep. It doesn't make sense from a food production point of view. It doesn't make sense from an environmental point of view. And the farmers are basically losing money on it. They're only, they're doing it because there's government subsidies in it. So it's a bonkers system, no matter how you look at it. And I think that could be, we have advocated for this, that as an emergency measure, we should be taking sheep off the hills, all of them immediately. It doesn't mean you have to end farming on the hills, but it would start to give us a bit of breathing space to just, so we can come up with plans for protecting peatlands and developing farming systems that are compatible with whatever part of the country that happens to be in. So so I think they are definitely very quick wins.
Okay, thanks for that, Pádraic. Just one comment from Jamie Rohu. Our politicians simply don't understand the problem.
I would say that, hi Jamie, I would say that may not be true. I think politicians, certainly a lot of them do understand the problem. A lot of them, of course, some of them, of course, are outright denialists. And a lot of them are kind of hiding behind the curtains in terms of not really having the courage to come out and say it. But I don't think it's a lack of understanding. But I do think a lot of them struggle with the scale of the issue and how, because we are talking about, you know, dramatic changes to what Ireland looks like and, you know, how we do things. And a lot of them really struggle with that. You know, how can we do that? How can they do that basically without losing their job, is the answer. And I think the counter to that is that we as citizens need to reward the ones that are willing to be bold and willing to take risks.
And thanks for that, Pádraic. And from Damien, I may have missed this at the start, but when is the Citizens' Assembly on Biodiversity recommencing and what are the deadlines? So they are meeting this weekend. Pádraic has actually been invited to address them, which is wonderful. And the deadlines are, they said that they are accepting submissions all through November. So I am going to share in the chat with you a link to our webpage with a lot of information, some FAQs that Pádraic has worked on for folks, some sample recommendations that we have in our own submissions from the ENGO community, and also a forward link to the Citizens' Assembly page themselves. Okay, so back to some other questions. What do you think to the idea of the 7,000 hectare proposed National Peatlands Park for the Midlands?
I don't know a huge amount about it, but I think I think in theory it's a good idea. The problem with national parks is that they don't actually exist. We have no legislation in Ireland to create national parks. At the moment, the national park is a brand that doesn't bring anything with it. So, and this is a problem with all of our protected areas more widely, that we have these areas that have the word protection in them, but no actual protection is happening. So I think it's wonderful. I think there is an initiative to globally to protect 30% of land and sea by 2030. Ireland has not signed up to that goal fully. The government has committed to protecting 30% of the sea by 2030, but not the land. But I think we should sign up to 30% on land, and that local communities would be key to that by identifying important areas and helping to manage them. But there's no point in doing these things if they're just going to be branding exercises. We see that as well with biosphere reserves. We have a number of biosphere reserves in Ireland, and they're little more than branding exercises.
Thanks for that, Pádraic. So we have a few more questions that have come in the chat. Pádraic, do you have a couple more minutes to
yeah, I'm not in a rush. If
okay, great. Yeah. Great. So one of the questions from Daniel is, do you think we have a definition problem? The terms wilderness, biodiversity, and nature all come with different connotations. How do we make sure we're talking about the same thing?
This is a very interesting question, Daniel, and in many ways we're prisoners of our language, unfortunately. And who knows if we? This is an incredible question, because imagine if we all spoke Irish, would we be using the same words and phrases that we use today? Maybe not, because our ancestors had very specific language about a lot of the things. Particularly the word for Irish, for instance, for the environment is coastal, which means to live together, which is an incredible word when you think about it. So the way we use language, unfortunately, we're just prisoners of it. That when we use, you know, biodiversity, it's kind of technical. If we use nature, it sounds very fluffy. We talk about the decline in biodiversity all the time. We talk about species going extinct like they are volunteering to become extinct. So our language can be a problem, but there we are, we're stuck with it. Wilderness is not a word that I use very much. I don't really like it. it comes laden, in my point of view, with colonialist ideas and separation. But we do have to watch our language. And thanks for that question, Daniel.
Okay, there's one more question from Daniel there, but I'm going to go to another one just to make sure everybody gets a say. Just transition is going to be crucial in all of this, but this term is often misused and poorly understood. It's a long-term process with justice and fairness at its center. Are there any kind of comments you might like to make on that one?
Yeah, well, I mean, Jamie, you have worked on this idea more than I have, and so you're right that it is pretty misunderstood. People I have spoken to feel that it is just kind of something that's tacked on to the end of a conversation just to kind of make the pill go down. So I think we do have to have a more developed discussion on this, particularly for sectors that simply are not compatible at all with a nature-friendly future. And I'm thinking about industrial fishing in particular, sheep farming on the hills. There are different circumstances, but you're right. We need to be talking about it with greater meaning and authenticity, I think.
And we probably have time for 2 more questions. One is from Jeremy Macquarie. We have a fully funded native woodland scheme. Perhaps you could comment on this.
So we've had a native woodland scheme for many years, but it hasn't been particularly successful. The non-native woodland scheme, if you want to call it that, has been much more successful, but that has also ground to a halt as well. Basically, nobody is planting or establishing forests anymore because of, well, on the face of it, because the entire forestry industry was operating outside of environmental law, and they've had to come to terms with that. There is an opportunity in the next, very shortly actually, there's a new forest strategy for Ireland. The good news is that they've done a lot of public consultation on it, and the message that is coming loud and clear is that people want more forests, but they don't want monoculture plantations and clear felling. They want native forests, or they want production forests that involve continuous cover. Whether that that swell in public opinion will make a difference at the end of the day is something we are working on a lot in the Irish Wildlife Trust, because the forest industry doesn't want to change. Like all of these, embedded industries, they don't want to change. They're finding it very hard. They're finding it very hard to use the language around biodiversity collapse. They see climate change as an opportunity for growth in their sector, because there's so much talk about planting trees in order to offset carbon emissions. And of course, they see huge revenues coming downstream from the voluntary carbon market. So we have to be very wary all the time of these things, and certainly we'll be pushing to make sure that we get a nature-friendly forestry system up and running in the coming years.
Thanks, Pádraic. One question from Joan from Cahersveen. When you say branding exercise, could you give a concrete example?
Yeah, it probably sounds a bit harsh, but I mean, Killarney National Park is probably the best example I can give you. Killarney National Park is used to attract tourists from all over the world. Millions went into renovating Muckra's house under the last government, and the forest itself is dying on its knees, and nothing is being done about it. There's no management plan for Killarney National Park, which you would imagine is the most spectacular and important biodiversity site anywhere on this island. And it has no management plan. It has very few staff. There are more rangers in the Phoenix Park than there are in Killarney National Park. So that's what I mean, that these labels like nature reserves and national parks, the term our last minister for nature conservation used was that these are engines for economic growth. That's a quote. So that is how these places are seen. They're not seen as being intrinsically important and worth investing in unless the investment is for car parks, greenways, cafes, and so on, that will drive more people into it, that will spend money in the local area.
Thanks, Pádraic. So I think that, Owen, there was one more question, is will you be sharing the slides? Yes, we are going to share this recorded session on our website and on social media. So yes, you will be able to see the slides again. So I think that was it for questions. I want to thank Pádraic and all of you for coming this afternoon. I hope you'll be able to join us at some of our future webinars, part of the same series. So next Wednesday, we'll be welcoming Dr. Elaine McGough as she gives a session on freshwater biodiversity. And that's next Wednesday at 1 p.m. And I've included the link to the invitation in the chat there. We'll also have, as I said, lots of information on our website about biodiversity loss, about what we could say to politicians and policymakers, and also to our fellow citizens through the Citizens Assembly. So I encourage you to please find out more. And there's also links to all of our IEN member groups who are active in local communities throughout the country right now, driving change at local, regional, and national level. So I'd encourage you to find out more and to get involved with us as we come together to work. What is the Irish word for environment? For
Oh, co-sale.
Co-sale. That's beautiful. And I think it's a really nice message to end the webinar on. So thanks very much, everybody, for taking the time to join us, and special thanks to Pádraic.
Thank you, Karen.
Bye, everybody.